What if Alexandria's library survived? Picture a night on the Nile where no smoke rises, no frantic bucket lines, no scrolls collapsing into ash like snow. Imagine the greatest archive of the ancient world, intact, its doors still open, its lamps still lit, its catalogs still humming with the names of vanished thinkers and patient copyists. If that light never went out, how would the shape of civilization bend? Not just a museum saved, but a timeline rewritten. Before we turn the wheel, let's ground ourselves in what really happened. The Library of Alexandria wasn't one building. It was a system, the Mouseion, the place of the Muses, and its satellite collections, including the Serapeum. Founded under the Ptolemies in the 3rd century BCE, it aspired to collect every book in the world. Ships docking in the harbor had their scrolls seized, copied, returned. Sometimes the copies were returned, the originals kept. It brought together Euclid, who drew the bones of geometry, Eratosthenes, who measured the earth with shadows and curiosity, and later, Heron, who toyed with steam. Yet the library didn't die in a single blaze. Caesar's siege in 48 BCE likely scorched warehouses. Centuries later, edicts and riots in the 4th century, when old gods fell and new faiths hardened, struck at its branches. By the 7th century, whatever survived was probably already a shadow. The famous tale of a caliph ordering scrolls burned as bath fuel is itself a legend. But the truth is colder. Neglect, politics, and time did the work. That is the world we inherited. A lot survived, through monasteries, through Baghdad's translators, through Byzantium's guardians, but not everything. So what if the calamitous chain never began? What if the institutional spine of the Alexandrian system stayed unbroken across conquests and creeds? The difference wouldn't be one room of papyrus saved, it would be continuity. A line that never snaps. Our fork begins in 48 BCE. Caesar does not torch the harbor warehouses or fire breaks hold. Cleopatra, fierce, multilingual, politically surgical, uses the reprieve to rebrand the library as a diplomatic jewel. Rome, dazzled by Egypt's learning, pours coin and prestige into the Mouseion. Instead of a pagan relic that future zealots might scorn, the library becomes an empire-endorsed academy. Imagine a Roman Senate annex named for Eratosthenes, a standing stipend for scholars, a legion of state copyists binding tax rolls and treatises alike. Alexandria starts to look less like a royal curiosity and more like a Mediterranean civil service of knowledge. Under the early empire, this knowledge bureaucracy expands. The Serapeum's scriptorium operates like a factory, teams of readers dictating to rows of scribes, standardized scripts, an army of binders. Outposts appear, Antioch, Pergamon, Rhodes, each tied into the Alexandrian catalog. The dream of every book in the world becomes a practical network. Sailors carry not only grain and glass, but tables of star positions, portolans with marginal notes, glossaries of Sanskrit botanical terms acquired from Indian traders who ride the monsoon. The library's scholars don't just collect, they test. Following Eratosthenes' example, they insist on measurement. They time shadow lengths at noon across the empire. They weigh, map, tabulate. In a society built on slave labor, applied science struggles to find a market. But prestige is a market. Engineers who solve water management for Roman estates get statues. Manuals are copied not as curiosities, but as tools. Then comes the 4th and 5th centuries, when the Roman world buckles and belief hardens. Here, continuity matters. In our timeline, the conversion of empire meets anxious crowds, and some mobs swing at symbols of a world they want to bury. In this alternate line, bishops and emperors already see the library as a non-pagan institution, a civic archive, a translation house, the place that copied the Septuagint centuries prior. The Church of Alexandria, proud of its intellectual tradition, treats the Mouseion as a citadel of commentary. Hypatia lives. Theon's daughter becomes the public face of a city where mathematicians and theologians debate under the same roof. Instead of purges, we get policies, book lists that shelve Platonic texts alongside scripture, marginalia negotiating what is metaphysics and what is metaphor. It is not utopia, it is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy survives. The Eastern Empire consolidates in Constantinople, and Alexandria becomes its southern brain. Paper arrives early via merchants who, through Red Sea links, learn the technique from Chinese intermediaries centuries before Baghdad's paper mills boom. Cheap writing material changes scale. Copying becomes faster, less sacred, more ubiquitous. By the 6th century, medical handbooks born in Alexandria travel to Syrian Bimaristans, translating physicians' stitch Galenic theory to practical hospital routines. Astrolabe workshops flourish in the markets near the Canopic Way. Navigation texts pin down the seasonal lung of the Indian Ocean in precise tables, sold to captains who can now predict wind like farmers predict harvests. The city that measured the earth now measures time with gears instead of gnomons. Mechanical clocks, crude but regular, appear a century or two ahead of schedule. Then the Arab conquests roll across the map. In our world, a century later, Baghdad's House of Wisdom ignites an age of translation, pulling Greek thought into Arabic, mixing it with Persian star lore and Indian numerals. In this world, the current is two-way. Alexandria and Baghdad form a hinge, not a replacement. Caliphs, recognizing the tax power of accurate maps and the prestige of astronomy, protect the library the way emperors once did. Scholars commute, not metaphorically, literally, sailing back and forth with stipends in both currencies. Indian numerals and the zero pass into Mediterranean accounting, not in the 10th century but in the 8th. Merchants balance ledgers with ease. Engineers compute with sin, and cause tables decades before sailors in the north ever hear the words. Because paper is plentiful, because commentaries multiply, because apprentices become masters in a city famed for measuring rather than merely intoning, algebra is not arcane, it is merchant math. What does this do to technology? Imagine the library sponsoring a prize for practical devices, judged in the courtyard under shade sails. A water pump that can lift irrigation 3 cubits higher than a screw. A windmill that pivots with changing wind. A loom with a clutch that allows one worker to drive multiple shuttles. Heroes' toys become prototypes. Prototypes become municipal contracts. Roman aqueduct maintenance manuals, copied and updated in Greek, Coptic, and Arabic, stay in circulation, meaning infrastructure decays more slowly in the post-Roman West. In Sicily and Egypt, olive presses inspire screw presses adapted for ink. The idea of presswork grows, from oils to paper to text. By the 13th century in this timeline, literacy spreads into guilds, not just monasteries. The press accelerates it. Metalworkers standardize punches and matrices for type, pushed along by treatises that specify tolerances and alloys. No Gutenberg miracle here, just a steady earlier convergence of materials, technique, and necessity. Typographic print arrives 2 centuries ahead of schedule in the Mediterranean basin, radiating into Italy, the Levant, and North Africa. Cheap books mean broad debate. The Reformation in this story does not erupt on German soil at the exact same time and place. Instead, reforming energy disperses earlier and wider, cushioned by a tradition of commentary. Public disputation thrives in Alexandria, Damascus, Palermo, Venice, cities tied into a criticism culture where the footnote is an art. Theology bends, censorship bites, then recedes. The argument continues, a little messier, a little earlier, a little less explosive. Mid-century plagues still come. The Black Death rides ships and flees with the same indifference. But public health looks different when a world knows how to record carefully and share fast. Port authorities in Alexandria keep quarantine books, dates, symptoms, ship origins, guides copied from older plague treatises that never fell out of print. Isolation protocols appear quicker in other harbors because those harbors read Alexandrian circulars. Mortality is still staggering, grief still infinite, economies still stumble. But the knowledge line does not break. When the dying ebbs, there is less reteaching to do. Here's a thought experiment that belongs on the wall of the library itself. How does exploration unfold when maps and math move faster? With magnetic compasses and better portolan charts pushing out from Alexandria and Venice, the Indian Ocean becomes not a mystery, but a highway standardized by tables. Swahili ports, Gujarati merchants, Red Sea brokers, all working off a shared corpus of navigation. Before Portugal knits a path around Africa in the 15th century in our world, this Mediterranean knowledge commonwealth organizes a joint expedition with Mamluk support down the East African coast. It is not one crown's secret, it is a contest of institutions. By the late 14th or early 15th century, circumnavigation of Africa is plausible from the east and the north almost simultaneously. The Atlantic becomes the next question, not a permanent wall. At this halfway mark, a quick pause. What single lost work would be worth saving if one shelf could be rescued? Aristarchus's full heliocentric treatise, Sappho's complete poems, or the missing books of Livy? Drop that in the comments. And if this kind of deep dive alternate history lights up your imagination, consider subscribing and liking, so the algorithm keeps this library of what-ifs alive for the next episode. Back to the map. America is still there, unknown to Eurasia, until sails cross the empty blue. But who arrives, and how, changes the cascade. Instead of a single Iberian monopoly kicking off a brutal age of frantic conquest, multiple consortia, Alexandrian Venetian, Portuguese Castilian, and even North African syndicates, launch competing voyages. They depart with better medical guides and a habit of cataloging flora and fauna. The collision of germs is still catastrophic. Smallpox does not negotiate, yet information about quarantine and inoculation-like practices travels back and forth more quickly. Ottoman and Alexandrian physicians, already debating variolation for smallpox, apply their thinking a touch earlier across more ports. Trade companies write manuals on how not to burn bridges with kingdoms they barely understand. Not every atrocity is averted, but some are delayed, some softened, some redirected into agreements, because institutions back home reward data kept, not just gold counted. Meanwhile, somewhere in Anatolian coal country, pumps built to keep mines dry are improving. Hero's lineage morphs into Savory's and Newcomen's ancestors, but they wear caftans and speak Greek, Arabic, and Italian along the workshop floor. Because the library never died, treatises on heat, pressure, and materials include centuries of argumentation laid end to end without the gaps we endured. Steam does not arrive in 1712 out of velvet nothing. It arrives in 1500s workshops trying to solve a tax problem, water where it shouldn't be, time that can't be bought. The first engines are clumsy. They hiss and leak and frighten horses. But they exist in a world where guilds already read, where improvements circulate in printed booklets, where a device made in Bursa is replicated in Alexandria 6 months later and criticized in Venice by Christmas. The political map bends with the machines. The Ottomans, still rising, inherit Alexandria as a jewel that pays for itself by training administrators and publishing navigational ephemerides. Venice becomes the clearinghouse of applied science patents. Constantinople anchors the arc between them. Spain and Portugal still push west. Britain still pulls coal from the ground. France still centralizes brilliance in salons. Yet the center of gravity is less lopsided. When Napoleon later dreams of Egypt, he does not arrive to discover savants in a land, legends say, forgot its past. He arrives to pitch a merger to an institution older than his state. The campaign reads as a failed corporate takeover, not a revelation. Religion, too, breathes differently. A culture of commentary anchored in Alexandria tames the reflex to ban what cannot be controlled. Not perfectly. Indexing forbidden books still appears. Heresy trials still flare. But the habit of shelving hard conversations instead of burning them leaves more paths open. Theologians borrow from mathematicians the comfort with provisional proofs. Lawyers borrow from astronomers the patience for anomalies. In this world, enslaved voices find printed allies earlier, jurists and preachers with access to a deep historical record arguing, in public, in multiple capitals, that bondage cannot stand scrutiny under law or revelation. The trans-Saharan trade is choked by policy and patent. Irrigation and textile improvements that make enslaved labor less economical combine with moral campaigns that make it less tolerable. By 1700, Europe as we know it exists, but it shares the stage with a Mediterranean federation of knowledge. The Alexandrian Baghdad axis functions like an early World Wide Web, slow, seasonal, made of ink and sail, but astonishingly resilient. When wars cut lines in one segment, Another route keeps packets moving. Jesuits send star charts to Alexandria. Alexandrian printers ship critiques back to Paris. Dutch lens grinders improve instruments and sell to Istanbul through intermediaries who speak 3 academic languages. The Enlightenment in this story is less Paris-centric and more polyphonic, a choir with lead singers in Cairo, Constantinople, Venice, and Amsterdam. The 19th century looks less like a story of a few European empires swallowing the globe and more like a brutally competitive, multipolar industrial world. Colonies still exist, but protectorates behave more like tangled commercial treaties than absolute possessions, because power is distributed, because no single knowledge node holds all the keys. Railways stitch North Africa sooner. The Nile's cataracts are measured not just for poetry but for hydropower potential. Telegraph lines thread coastlines earlier. A student in Tunis writes to a mentor in Naples about a perplexing experiment. A letter arrives in Alexandria with 2 new equations scrawled in a margin, printed the following week for a seminar that includes a rabbi, an imam, and a Jesuit. A myth? Maybe, but the path is logical. Institutional continuity breeds habits that outlive monarchs. Now pull back. The great seduction of the Library of Alexandria is to imagine a singular miracle that fixes everything. It wouldn't. Humanity would still suffer from greed, fear, and the entropy of empires. Fires would still burn, although maybe fewer of them would be aimed at shelves. There would be heresies and hammerfalls, betrayals and backslides. But a library that never died would have changed our default setting. Instead of rediscovering old knowledge in waves, Renaissance then more, civilization would have walked a less interrupted path. Some catastrophes would hurt less because manuals survived. Some inventions would arrive earlier because the conversation never stopped. Some borders would look different because maps were shared before flags were planted. In the end, the survival of Alexandria's library is a metaphor for a discipline. Copy what matters, translate what you fear, test what you claim, and keep the room open for the next argument. It is not immortality that changes the world. It is continuity. And a single night without smoke on a single harbor might have been enough to give continuity a fighting chance. So ask this as the lamps dim in our speculative reading room. If a civilization can keep its memory, how much faster can it learn its mercy? The answer isn't written, but the shelves, intact, would have made it much easier to try.